My lady, I think, sorry, before the witness is sworn, there was a couple of small housekeeping matters. Should I deal with those first?
Well, as First Minister standing up, you carry on with the oath. Oops, sorry, throwing my pen at you.
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly, declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, and thank you for coming to help again.
Good morning.
Ms Dobbin, housekeeping.
My lady, if I deal with those two small housekeeping matters. First of all, you might recollect last week that you weren't able to hear evidence from Mr. Conor Murphy, and that was pending the results of some medical tests. And I said on behalf of the inquiry that we would revisit this with you. The inquiry has received an update from Mr. Murphy's legal representatives and a copy of a doctor's letter. And by this update, the inquiry has been informed that he's undergone further medical treatment and that he's been advised that he should rest for 2 weeks pending further advice. So we wanted to update you that that was the position and seek your agreement that we could inform Mr. Murphy that in these circumstances he would be excused attending this public hearing to give evidence. If you were agreeable to that course, we would respectfully request that his witness statement is published on the inquiry website after this hearing has concluded, and we'll give some thought again on behalf of the inquiry to whether he might be asked to give evidence at some point in the future, or consider whether or not his statement, of course with other evidence that you've heard in Module 2C, satisfactorily covers the issues that the inquiry would have investigated or asked Mr. Murphy questions about. But I think the first issue is whether or not you're content to adopt that course.
I am. Thank you, Ms Dobbin. We'll come back to whether or not we need to hear from Mr. Murphy at a later date.
And the second matter that arises is that when the inquiry published the timetable, I think it was the timetable for this week, it omitted to mention or to specify when former Assistant Chief Constable Todd would be giving evidence. It was always intended that he give evidence, but he was missed for the timetable for tomorrow. I think that has been rectified on the public timetable that's published on the website, but I thought it was important this morning just to draw that to your attention, that there had been that omission, but that he will be appearing tomorrow.
And I think it's in the afternoon slot?
That's correct, my lady.
After
he
Baroness
is scheduled
Foster.
for after Baroness Foster.
Thank you very much.
My lady, may I call then the first witness, or the only witness for today? Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Michelle O'Neill.
Miss O'Neill, you ought to have 2 witness statements in front of you. I think you should have a first witness statement that you signed on the 12th of March 2024. And I think you signed that statement at page 106.
That's correct.
And are you content that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I am.
And you ought to have a much shorter second statement in front of you, which you signed on the 15th of March 2024, signed at page 10.
Yes, that's correct.
And again, Miss O'Neill, are you content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, that's correct.
Miss O'Neill, turning first then, if I may, to your background, I think it's right that you've been a member of the Legislative Assembly for the Mid-Ulster constituency since 2007.
Yes, that's right.
During that time, you were Minister for Agriculture and Rural Development for a period. Yes.
Correct. Yeah.
And you were also the Minister for Health for a period between May 2016 and March 2017.
That's right.
Is that also correct? And you were the Deputy First Minister from the 11th of January to the 4th of February 2022.
That's correct.
So you were in position for the period of time that this inquiry is most concerned with, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And it's also right to say that since the resumption of power sharing just a short time ago, you're now the First Minister for Northern Ireland,
I am,
correct? And I think in addition to all of that, it's right that you remain the Vice President of the Sinn Féin party as well. Is that also correct? And is that a national role, Miss O'Neill?
It is.
So is it, sorry, when I say that, is it a role in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, or is it just in respect of the North?
Across the island of
Northern
Ireland.
Thank you. Turning then to the period that this inquiry is most concerned with. You were the joint head of government in Northern Ireland, correct?
That's correct.
You were jointly responsible for leading the response of the government in Northern Ireland to the pandemic.
That's
correct. And leading is the critical descriptor, isn't it? You weren't just a convener of the executive committee or an administrator of that committee. You were a leader of ministers, correct?
A leader of the executive in our particularly unique circumstance of government, yes.
But you were a leader of ministers.
A leader of the executive, yes.
And when it came to the pandemic, you were leading a response which goes to the most solemn of all government responsibilities, weren't you?
That's correct.
That of the protection of the people in Northern Ireland.
Yes.
And do you accept that?
Yes.
And do you accept that leadership involves inculcating the ethos and the values that you would wish other ministers to display as well?
Yes.
And do you accept that that's all the more so during a period of national emergency or during a pandemic?
Of course.
And do you consider that you and the ministers of Northern Ireland provided the leadership to the people of Northern Ireland that they deserved during the pandemic?
Yes, I do. And if you want, I'll elaborate further on that, if that's okay. The backdrop to the Assembly and Executive being restored was public services being decimated with 10 years of austerity cuts, health service on its knees. We didn't have functioning government for 3 years prior to that. Ministers were just back around the executive table on the 11th of January, just a short number of weeks before the pandemic really took hold. And I believe the public were best served by having locally elected ministers around the executive table, albeit, and I know we'll interrogate this throughout the course of today, albeit not always perfect, but I do believe that every executive party around that table were there to do their best. They were there to save lives. They were there to work together as best we could. And they were there to deal with an unprecedented global pandemic that none of us had ever experienced before, even though there were varying degrees of experience within the executive itself. I think it's fair to say that no government had faced this type of global emergency before, and we were all in new territory. But I genuinely believe that the public here were best served by having those locally elected ministers in place.
Well, the question wasn't about whether or not they were best served, Ms O'Neill. It was whether or not you and the ministers of Northern Ireland provided people in Northern Ireland with the leadership that they deserved. That was the question.
Yes, I believe that we did.
And do you think that you provided them with the leadership that they deserved during the pandemic?
Yes, I did.
Well, perhaps we'll look at that a little bit more closely. Ms O'Neill, I was going to start, if I may, with some messages between you and Baroness Foster from the 21st of March. Perhaps if I could ask for those to be brought up on screen. That's INQ 000 400 592. It's the 21st of March, Miss O'Neill. And do you agree that the pandemic or the threat that Northern Ireland faced had crystallised by this point and that things were in a very difficult position?
Yes, I do. By the 21st of March, yes.
And I think that we can see here that Baroness Foster was accusing you of having publicly undermined the Health Minister, pointing out that if you wanted to effect a change in policy, you were going about it completely the wrong way, that you were playing politics when things were much too serious, and that it was hugely disappointing. But she says, unfortunately, I'm not surprised, correct?
That's her statement, yes.
And you go on to say it's too serious to tolerate incompetence. Things are too slow. Lives will be lost. Start listening. Yes?
Yes.
And Baroness Foster goes on to say, I hope you're not calling two of your ministerial colleagues incompetent. Naomi and Robin have both raised concerns about your behaviour. You need to be more collegiate. Yes?
Yes.
And then you go on to say the department is not serving Robin well. We're not being served well by the civil service. Yes?
Yes.
And you go on to say our nurses are crying out for help to do their jobs. Yes?
Yes.
That can be taken down. Thank you. We see in embryonic form, don't we, in that exchange, Miss O'Neill, a number of the issues that played out during the pandemic. Do you agree?
I think that, yes, I think it reflects the difficulty that we were facing, I suppose the scale of the challenge that we're facing, the difficulties that we had internally within the system. And that particular period is reflecting the aftermath of the issue around school closures and the discussions that we had around how we were served in terms of the medical advice that we were receiving. I don't think it reflects, I don't think it reflects probably any difference that probably most governments around the world would have been experienced in terms of how they thought that we should deal with the pandemic. And given the uncertainty and the unprecedented nature of it, I would imagine that these were not unique to ourselves in terms of how we were trying to manage and get through it. But that particular exchange is in a context to a particular issue of school closures.
I think I meant something rather different, Miss O'Neill. The allegation of playing politics, that is something, isn't it, that we see throughout the course of 2020 and into 2021 by you and your colleagues. Do you agree?
As in all of the executive colleagues?
A number of your executive colleagues, including you, at points in time throughout 2020.
No, I absolutely refute that. I don't accept that I played politics. I accept that the severity of the situation reflected my attention, the severity of the situation in terms of trying to find consensus around an executive table around an issue which was so serious, such as school closures, meant that I tried my very best to try to find that consensus within the executive. That was not forthcoming, and the issue was far too serious to sit back and say nothing.
All right. Well, I'm not just talking about the school closures, Miss O'Neill, but we'll examine how a number of difficult issues were dealt with by you and your colleagues. But just coming back to what this exchange might encapsulate, does it not also encapsulate dysfunction, that this was the way that you and Baroness Foster communicated with each other about these most serious of issues, that it's reduced to this kind of WhatsApp conversation between you?
But of course, this was a conversation between ourselves, not supposed to be played out in public. It expresses the difficulty that we were having at that time, and at different times throughout the pandemic we had a difference of approach. That's not politicking. That's about what's the right way and what's the wrong way. And in my opinion, at that time, the approach being adopted, and I think that some of the minutes of previous exchanges between CMO, the head of the civil service, etc., they were pushing back in terms of what I was advocating, which was for us to act faster, and felt that we were overreaching into health. And I think the First Minister then got behind that approach also, and that then led to that difficulty.
Yeah, I meant rather more the nature of the conversation or the discourse between you conveyed in these messages. It's hardly mature discussion between two leaders, is it?
It was the nature of the difficulty of the circumstance. Arlene and I probably agreed on quite a lot of things throughout the pandemic. This demonstrates one exchange at one point in time. And as I said, I refute the allegation of playing politics. This was about saving lives and what I thought was the right thing to do.
And does that explain your lack of collectivity at this point? The fact that you were speaking out against other ministers, again, at this crucial and sensitive period for Northern Ireland?
Well, if you may, I'd like to put it in some context. The pandemic was rapidly developing. People were watching the unfolding scenes across the world. Internationally, what was happening in China, Italy and elsewhere. We're in mid-March at this stage. People are very alarmed. People are watching the approach of the British government in London. At this stage, we've had Cheltenham go ahead. We've had Atletico Madrid soccer game, go ahead. Large crowds were gathering. People had made up their own mind that the Boris Johnson government approach was too slow. It was incongruous to what the WHO were advocating, what ECDC were advocating, and at that very same time, we also had a situation where school closures had happened in the other part of this island, in the south, and parents couldn't understand what the difference was, and I tried to interrogate the difference in approach, but I couldn't be satisfied that the approach that was being advocated, because our CMO was obviously following the approach of SAGE, and the advice that was coming from London, to me, was fundamentally flawed. I tried to interrogate that. I tried to get the right decision in the executive, and I know that you yourself have interrogated some of that evidence, particularly in relation to the pushback that I got from the head of the civil service, that I was moving ahead of the science, the pushback that we got from the CMO and the health minister to say that this was not the right time to move.
If I can,
But we had, if I just finish just briefly, but we also were in danger of losing the room. People were voting with their feet. Parents had already chosen to take their children out of school. The Catholic bishops had come out and asked schools to close. The public confidence in our ability to lead from that very early time was being diminished, and I was trying to recapture that. Is it ideal to do it outside of the executive? No, it's not. Preferably, as I did, I tried to change the position from within. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And within a matter of 2 days, the British government changed their approach, and the CMO then changed the approach and advice here. Nothing had changed to when I advocated that position.
So, Ms
2
O'Neill,
days previous.
forgive me, I didn't mean to speak over you. I am actually going to come back and look
Sure.
over all of
Sorry.
this in much more detail about what was being said at that point in time. So I didn't want to cut you off,
Sorry.
because we are going to come back to it and deal with it in more detail. I just wanted to focus on the themes, perhaps,
Sure.
that might be seen, as I've said, an embryo in those exchanges. But blaming others, that's something that you have done throughout your witness statement, isn't it? I mean, your second witness statement to this inquiry. The constant theme throughout it, do you agree, is that you blame the UK government for the slowness of its approach in the initial stages of the pandemic? Do you agree?
I don't accept that I blame others throughout the statement. I accept that I point out where I think things were wrong, and in particular, I do believe that my position's vindicated in terms of the fact that Boris Johnson and his government were too slow to act at the start of the pandemic.
I just want to go, if I can, please, to your 12th of March statement. If we could go, please, to page 98 and to paragraph 383. I'm just going to take this from the outset, Miss O'Neill, what you've set out there, that it's a reality that as the pandemic progressed, the approach of the Tory government to the pandemic was not consistent with the approach by the executive. As I've acknowledged, we were largely aligned with the UK for the reasons I have explained. But as the pandemic progressed, we did adopt a more localised response, which responded to the realities of the pandemic in the north. The approach of the Tory government to the pandemic is in many ways epitomised by the evidence which has emerged of partying in number 10 Downing Street in breach of the regulations introduced to protect the public from the pandemic. Staff parties of the type which are now a matter of public knowledge did not occur in our local context and would frankly have been unthinkable. I believe it's emblematic of the failure of the Johnson administration to appropriately engage with and respond to the gravity of the pandemic and its impact on the lives of those we are elected to represent. Ms O'Neill, there's no reflection, I don't think, nor any insight in your witness statement about any of the hurt or any of the problems that you caused by attending the funeral of Mr. Storey. Do you agree?
I think I have addressed that in my statement and in previous statements, but if you allow me, I'd be happy to address it right now.
Certainly.
Sure, thank you. And maybe perhaps even to go directly to the families, because it's those people that have been impacted by my actions, and if that's okay, I would like to address them.
I'm afraid, Ms O'Neill, you're here to give evidence, not to address people. I think you need to give your evidence.
You're basically
To yourself.
addressing me.
Okay, okay, sorry, my lady. I mean, I have to say up front, and I do want to direct, I'm glad that we're actually able to speak about this so early on in the evidence, because there is no doubt that the families themselves have been through an experience that there is no coming back from. It's been absolutely horrendous, and to lose loved ones in a way in which they have has been just absolutely horrendous. I have met some of the families individually. I have equally listened to some of the testimony the testimony that was offered at the start of the inquiry. And no family should ever have to go through what these families have went through. I also know equally that my actions compounded the hurt and that horrible experience that those families have went through. I also know that my actions also angered the families, and for that I'm truly sorry. I am sorry for going, and I'm sorry for the hurt that's been caused after that. And I want to make that statement very clear on the record again today.
Did you realise at the time the hurt and anger that going to the funeral would cause?
I didn't, but I ought to have.
Could we bring up on screen, please, INQ 000 474 208, please? These are the minutes of the meeting that took place after the funeral with your executive colleagues. And you addressed them at, well, from the bottom of page 1. And if we go over the page, I think you invite your colleagues to divorce their views of Mr. Story from your actions, that you were invited by the family, that you were honoured to do so. Huge figure, knew thousands would wish to attend. Online streaming, watched by 250,000 people. If I go down that a little bit, people entitled to view, people vote with feet. Applause along the Andersonstown Road. No dilution in my mind of public message. No offence intended. And if we go on, please, to look at page 7. Mr. Murphy's not been able to give evidence, but in terms of what he said, rules relaxed, not same circumstances, technicalities. He sets out a bit about his attendance. And then over the page, people can say what they want to say, entitled to opinion. I'm entitled to be sceptical. You were entirely unapologetic on the 2nd of July, weren't you?
So I think that I have reflected there. I think I would go further than what I said in that minute. It was immediately after the funeral itself, and I think what I've said there in terms of not diluting the public message, that was wrong, because clearly I did, and I have acknowledged that. And equally, I've worked every day ever since to regain public confidence and trust. I think I took every opportunity that I had in terms of the aftermath in both the Assembly Chamber, in front of the Scrutiny Committee. I've said it publicly on a number of occasions about how sorry I am, and I am absolutely from the bottom of my heart sorry, because I would never, ever set out to hurt people.
Can I just ask, in relation to your witness statement, when you made your witness statement, you made the criticisms of Boris Johnson's government and the allegations of partying in Downing Street, wasn't that a bit hypocritical, knowing what you knew by the time you made that statement?
I don't think so, because they're two very different things in terms of the Boris Johnson approach of partying the whole way through the pandemic and drinking their way through it, to be quite blunt.
Well, we didn't find out about the partying until after the pandemic. I mean, what you did was to do something that the bereaved couldn't do, the normal bereaved couldn't do, because you wanted to go to a friend's funeral. Isn't that then saying that what Boris Johnson's government did was wrong, is a bit hypocritical?
No, I don't think so, because what I did under the understanding of the regulations at that time, and I know we don't want to open that up, my lady, but I have answered to that. But I do accept wholeheartedly that I, in some way, damaged our executive relations with colleagues who had been working very hard with me the whole way through. I also accept wholeheartedly that I damaged the public health messaging, and I had work to do to regain that. But I did that. I worked hard to regain that trust and confidence and to lead us for the next year and a half through the pandemic.
So the only reason I'm pressing on the statement is the point of principle is that those who set the rules should obey the rules both in spirit and in the letter. That's really the point I'm making.
Yeah, and I should have anticipated the outworking of what I did.
Sorry to interrupt.
Was it really that difficult to anticipate the outworking of what you did, Miss O'Neill?
It was, insofar as far as I was concerned, on a personal invite, attending a cortege of 30 people. And I tried not to open this up, but just that's the basis on which I attended. But I've said it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what it did. I should have, anticipated the fallout. I should have anticipated what would happen in the aftermath. And that's why I've worked hard to try to regain that confidence and trust. And equally, and more importantly, I think it's about all of the families of bereaved and people who went through a horrific circumstance and the experience that they've had. It's just horrendous, and I would never set out to try to compound that or in any way make it more difficult for them to deal with their grief.
One of the first questions I asked you was whether or not people from Northern Ireland got the leadership that they deserved from you. How can you maintain that they did in light of what you've just accepted?
Because I didn't say that everything was perfect all of the time. I do believe that I did lead from the front the whole way through the pandemic, as did all of my executive colleagues. We've had difficulties, we've had challenging times, we've worked through very difficult times, which I'm sure you'll want to speak about. But I do believe that I led the whole way through, albeit I've put my hands up in terms of the funeral itself and how I shouldn't have done that, because that took away from all of the work that I had put into trying to lead us through the pandemic, which was hard on everybody right across society. We were faced as an executive with hugely difficult, challenging decisions to take, and I worked day and night to get us through this pandemic. So apart from this one time, I do believe that my leadership was strong through the pandemic.
All right, well, let's examine that. I wanted to start, and I wanted to go really to those first months of the pandemic in order to understand what government in Northern Ireland was doing to respond. And I wanted to start with what you say about this in your witness statement, please. And if we could go, please, to page 9, paragraph 29. And I've gone to paragraph 29 just to orientate us in time. So this was the 25th of February. And I'll come back to that strategic review, Miss O'Neill. But just looking at paragraph 30 and what you say there, at this time, so that's the time period that you're talking about, the Department of Health remained the lead department in responding to the predicted global pandemic. TEO staff had stood up CCG, and I am going to come back to that, and were involved in official level meetings from the 20th of February. And then you set out a submission that you received, and I'm going to go to that. But you say this: the CCG structures were still operating at an official level, as Department of Health officials had not yet activated NICMA arrangements in line with established civil contingency protocols. At this point in time, and as the civil contingency arrangements were still operating at a proprietary and official level, the Executive Committee had no direct role in overseeing the response. However, ministers were being briefed and were ready to step in as and when needed. I think a number of points arise from paragraph 30. First of all, it wasn't for Department of Health officials to activate NICMA, was it?
Well, I believe it was, because they were, in terms of the lead department, and all correspondence that we'd received to that point made it very clear that health were the lead department. And I also believe that some of the information you've explored points to the fact that health were resisting NICMA being stood up and hadn't indicated that we were at the stage yet where that would be helpful.
We're going to take this one step at a time.
Sure.
And I'm going to ask you to perhaps base your answers on what you understood at the time as opposed to evidence that you've heard in this inquiry. Looking at what you've said, the structures were still operating at an official level as Department of Health officials had not yet activated NICMA arrangements. Are you familiar with the 2016 protocol for civil contingencies arrangements in Northern Ireland?
Yes, I am.
Then you will know that it was completely within your powers or those of the Executive Office to be able to activate those arrangements. Do you agree?
Well, I think, again, in context, I think we have to be very clear that all advice was very clear. And we remember we have no other specialised advice that all sat within the Department of Health. We were told by the head of the civil service, by everybody that we engaged with, any correspondence we had, that health were the lead department, and that at that point they were leading the charge, if you like, in terms of our response. It's only slightly further down past the February date, towards the end of February, where it starts to become very clear that we need to move towards the NICMA arrangements being stood up. And I think that, forgive me, but it's hard not to reflect on some of the evidence that you have referred to throughout the course of the inquiry. It's very clear that we were being resisted in terms of setting up NICMA because health were the lead department. However, I do think that on reflection, that it's very clear that given the resistance that we had from health because they felt that perhaps we were overreaching or interfering in their area of work, that there needs to be, or the ability to stand up NICMA earlier perhaps could have been much more beneficial in terms of other departments being able to come together in a more unified way earlier on.
I'm not quite at the point of asking for reflection, Ms O'Neill. Do you accept that under the 2016 arrangements, you had the power, you and the First Minister had the power to stand up the central or the civil contingencies arrangements for Northern Ireland Government?
Well, I think it's a matter of fact that, yes, we could have, but it's also equally a matter of fact that the Department of Health were in the lead and advising against it. I had no other alternative view, and officials weren't bringing forward recommendations as to that we should, this is the advice from officials, that we should move forward with this at this time. I think there was a roundly accepted view within the system of the civil service that health were in the lead, and it was the understanding of ourselves that health was in the lead and would indicate to us whenever they needed to move beyond the health alone front and move into that wider civil contingency space.
Can you help me as to when you were advised, and I'm talking about a point in time, when you were advised by the Department of Health that you shouldn't set up the civil contingencies arrangements or that they weren't required?
I will have to just check the date, but I'm very clear that from very early on that we were being told from from the 30th of January from Bernie Rooney to TEO that health were in the lead. We were being told on the 15th of February that health were in the lead. We were told on the 3rd of March from the Civil Contingencies Policy Branch that health were in the lead. So we had no reason to go counter to that at that stage. However, by the 3rd of March, it was becoming clear that it needed to be much wider than a health response. And I think that's where you can start to see the change in terms of pace and the work that was done across civil contingencies.
Just because health were in the lead, that didn't negate the fact that you and the First Minister were the joint leaders of the Northern Ireland Government. Do you agree?
It was a health pandemic and we were being very much guided by health, and there are times when you can see that Chief Medical Officer's advice was that they didn't need the NICMA structures, that it would actually interfere with the work that they are doing. And I had no other advice to counter that, and that was the difficulty. I think
it must have been very apparent to you early on, Miss O'Neill, that this was more than a health pandemic and that it would raise serious issues for the whole of Northern Ireland.
It, of course, became increasingly clear that it was going to become much wider, but we were only in the executive from the middle of January. We were getting brief from the head of the civil service. We had these developments that I've just referred to over the course of those weeks. So it was becoming increasingly clear, of course, over time that we needed that wider structure, which is why we moved to that point in early March.
Can you help us then with what you also say at paragraph 30? The Executive Committee had no direct role in overseeing the response.
Yeah,
Sorry, first of all,
sorry.
is that up and until the 20th of February?
Yes,
It had
because it was
no
being led
role?
by the Department of Health.
So again, is your evidence to this inquiry that you and the Executive Committee had effectively left this to the Department of Health?
Absolutely
That you
not.
had no responsibility for it?
No, I didn't say that. What I'm referring to is that the Department of Health were the lead department in terms of preparedness. We're being told that in all of our advice and all of our exchanges that we had with either the Hawks or the Department of Health itself, the Minister or CMO. What was very clear is that they were in the lead, and despite at different times us asking for what else we needed to be doing in terms of that wider cross-departmental response, the view of health was that it was too soon, it would interrupt their work, and I had no other advice to counter that, so that was the difficulty that we had. However, it's just beyond this time that I think that you can start to see the pace of things change in terms of the standing up of the civil contingencies.
So I want to just stick with this for a moment. The Executive Committee had no direct role in overseeing the response. You must accept, though, that the Executive Committee had direct responsibility for overseeing the response.
Yeah, I think that it's important, again, to say that all the advice that we were given, both myself and Arling, was that the Department of Health were in the lead and that we shouldn't disrupt the work that they were doing. That being said, at this stage, we had been briefed on the 3rd of February, I think the 10th of February, we were continually engaged with the preparedness work and what was actually happening. We were having conversations with Health and with the head of the Civil Service. But very clearly, shortly after that time, that's whenever civil contingencies kicked in.
I think the question permits of a yes or no answer. Did the Executive Committee have responsibility for the response to the pandemic up and until the 20th of February?
The Executive Committee, it was the Department of Health who were in the lead.
That's not an answer. They may have been in the
Well,
lead.
then, no, the Department of Health were in the lead.
Are you saying that the Executive Committee did not have responsibility, the overarching responsibility, Miss O'Neill, for the response to the pandemic up and until the 20th of February?
I think you've explored some of the unique nature, my lady, of our political apparatus and how we're established. We're a product of a peace agreement in 1998. We have a very siloed mentality, departmental structure. There is ministerial autonomy in terms of what a minister can do. There is legalities around overreaching into other ministers' responsibilities. And I think you too have expressed some concern about, and on reflection and having come through the pandemic, I shared this view that there needs to be some sort of emergency ability to step in and to change that structure, at least temporarily, for the period of a pandemic or another unpredicted circumstance such as that, because, as has been explained, the Executive Office and the role of First and Deputy First Minister, whilst it has a coordinating role for the Executive, the problem is that you cannot direct other ministers to do certain things. Even the head of the Civil Service, because of the unique circumstance, can't direct other permanent secretaries to do certain things. So that makes, I think, the response to a pandemic or some other circumstances quite difficult in terms of our own system of governance. So I just wanted to put that in that context.
I think we understand that, Miss O'Neill, and I think the inquiry has seen evidence that the way departments operate and their legal position may cause this siloing or compartmentalisation. But that's not really the question I'm asking you. I think the question that's being asked is a far, far more fundamental one. And it's whether or not you accept that there was a collective responsibility which you were leading for the response to the pandemic up and until the 20th of February.
Well, let me say, of course, I accept that we have a collective responsibility to lead and to get us through the pandemic. But at this point, up until this time, the Department of Health were the lead department, operating all the preparatory work, responding to the pandemic as they were instructed by SAGE in terms of the influenza approach. They were very, very much in the lead. However, at this stage also, CCG staff had been working to start to coordinate that work across departmental. And then it came to the attention of ourselves, myself and Arling, in the briefing of the 3rd of March. That was the time in which we had to officially kick in, and that's where we became the holder, if you like, of the direction of overseeing the response.
Well, I think you have accepted somewhere in that answer that there was responsibility. But just coming back to your repeated reference to the fact that the Department of Health were the lead department, again, just to be clear about this, to make sure that we're proceeding on a common understanding, the fact that there's a lead department in a response to a national emergency, it does not obviate, does it, the responsibility, the collective responsibility that the Executive Committee had for the response to the pandemic?
No, I think that that's correct insofar as the Department of Health were in the lead, but at the right juncture, after we'd been receiving considerable pushback, we did get to the point where we had CCG stood up, and the whole of the Executive was then, in terms of the approach to the whole Executive was working together in terms of the CCG response.
But Ms O'Neill, what about oversight, collective oversight of what the Department of Health was doing? What about scrutiny? What about seeking detailed plans and detailed understanding of what was being done on behalf of the people of Northern Ireland in order to respond to the pandemic? That was the collective responsibility, wasn't it?
And that did happen.
When did that happen?
That happened from very early on, from our first meeting of the Health Minister on the 3rd of February, I believe, is the date that he brought it first officially to the Executive. Then at every meeting after that is where we would have had the opportunity to ask questions, probe the information that was coming forward, interrogate the advice that was coming forward. And that happened, I think, well, that happened certainly from that 3rd of February when it was first brought to the Executive. So I suppose that's where the collective conversations and approach started to develop.
Well, I'm glad we've located where that scrutiny took place, and we'll obviously go to the minutes and examine that. I wanted to go, though, to a briefing that you received. If we could bring up, please, INQ 000 391 226. This was a briefing that was prepared for you, and it was after the first Cobra meeting. Or sorry, it wasn't. It was after the second Cobra meeting that took place in January, correct?
Yes.
And if we could go over the page, please. Thank you. And to the next page, please, to paragraph 2. We can see reference to the fact that the level of risk was due to increase to moderate. Yes?
Yes.
It does go on to say, in practical terms, this makes little or no difference, but rather reflects the increase in spread of the virus. Health officials will continue to undertake the same precautionary measures and levels of preparedness. Did you challenge in any way the advice that you were being provided with in this briefing to you, or did you seek to ascertain what the change in risk signified?
I don't have that absolute recollection, but I would be fairly certain that I would have. We would have asked questions, no doubt, whenever we receive a submission like this. And again, I do recall at that point, again, the point being made about the Department of Health being the lead, and they continue to take the same precautionary measure and level of preparedness.
So if we go down then, thank you, that can come down, and just look at what you were being told the current situation was, and look particularly at the first two bullet points after 4. So we can see that you were being told that it was spreading throughout China and globally. We can see that you were being told that it could be asymptomatic and that it could range from a mild illness to pneumonia, correct?
Yes.
And if we go to page 4, paragraph 7. So all devolved administrations to review reasonable worst case pandemic plans for preparedness, correct?
Yes.
And if we go please to page 7 and paragraph 1. And it's yes, thank you. It's that paragraph 1 that refers to those who are elderly and who have existing health conditions being disproportionately affected. Yes?
Yes.
And then it refers to the Cobra again, to reasonable worst case scenario planning as set out in slide 9 of CRIP 2. And would you have had the CRIP as well sitting alongside these minutes? I think that we've heard that they were provided to the TEO.
I couldn't honestly say that we did have the CRIP at that stage. I'm fairly certain we would have as an addendum to the paper, but I'm not fully certain.
All right, that can come down, thank you. Do you accept, Miss O'Neill, that by the 30th of January you had been provided with quite a lot of information that indicated just how serious the picture was becoming about the spread of COVID-19 and the risks that it presented?
By the 30th of January, I was observing for myself what was happening internationally.
Yes.
By the 30th of January, that's the first official submission that has come in to myself and to the First Minister at the time. And it's from that point that we're engaged, because that was the preamble, if you like, to the Health Minister then presenting to the first executive meeting on the 3rd, 4 days later. And that was what would informed the briefing that was given. And also it equally informed the CMO at that stage, then sent a memo out to all departments around that reasonable worst case scenario planning and influenza planning.
So did you start to ask questions then about what Northern Ireland's reasonable worst case scenario planning for a pandemic was and what those plans looked like?
Yes, and we would have been starting to work our way through that, and you can see that then developed throughout the course of the executive meetings where we were asking for more of this information to come through.
So are you talking about the meetings in February that you were scrutinising and asking about those plans?
Yes, so we would have, I believe, somewhere around this time also met with the head of the civil service, and they would have told us about the civil contingencies work that was happening at official level and supporting health as the lead department. I mean, I can't emphasise that enough. That was the approach that was taken, and we can all reflect on that. I know you don't want to get into reflections now, but we all will reflect on that. But the Department of Health were very firmly in the lead of the response up until this sort of period where things start to change.
I think what the inquiry is really interested in is understanding what planning was actually going on in Northern Ireland in February and what that in fact amounted to. And that's just what I want to focus on now, is understanding what you saw in February 2020 that reassured you or provided you with a real understanding of what this reasonable worst case scenario planning was in Northern Ireland.
So I think because it was so unprecedented and extraordinary times that we were probably all trying to find our way and to ask the relevant and pertinent questions as the situation was being developed. We were told consistently, the health advice was that we were still in containment phase, that we were told that the way the risk was referred to there as being moderate. We very much relied on the advice that we were getting from CMO and from health in terms of the progression. You saw a number of statements that we made to the Assembly Chamber so that elected representatives could be informed in terms of the approach. But I think that when you think back in terms of the health being the lead, I mean, I think it was understandable for all executive colleagues to believe that that was the right approach at those early times, because there was no other expertise outside of the Department of Health, and because the response was due to be as per influenza planning. I think that it became very clear then, as things developed, that we needed to have that wider systems approach. And I think that that's what you see developed whenever myself and the First Minister of that time got together and actually started to bring together that CCG work.
Sorry, I'm not... Maybe it was the way I asked the question. What did you see in February 2020? What plans did you see, did you scrutinise or interrogate in order to understand what the reasonable worst-case scenario planning for a pandemic, per the note from Ms Rooney of the 30th of January, amounted to?
I can't recall the exact date, but I will try to provide that to the inquiry. But we would have had a paper sent to the executive where we all would have discussed what this potentially could look like, interrogated that with both the Health Minister and the CMO. We didn't have a Chief Scientific Advisor at that time. But to be helpful to the inquiry, I will certainly find that date.
I'm talking about plans.
Yeah, but the plan, the date the plan would have been brought.
What you understood and what you scrutinised, as had been suggested by Cobra,
Yeah.
to understand what the reasonable worst-case scenario plans were across government in Northern Ireland. That's what I'm trying to understand.
But again, at that time, it was very much a health lead, and it was their influenza plan that was being brought forward. And I don't recall at what date that was shared with the executive, but I'm happy to try to find that out.
Well, what the note of the 30th of January said was that the devolved administrations should review their worst-case scenario plans for a pandemic. So there might be a health component to that, yes? But
our understanding was that it was absolutely a health-led pandemic, so therefore a health-led plan. And that's the difference between we're not like Scotland, we're not like Wales. We don't operate in the same structure as others do. I don't offer that up to try to shirk responsibility. I offer it up as a political reality of the circumstance in which we were trying to deal with the pandemic. Health had the plan in terms of the reasonable worst case scenario, but then that obviously came across into civil contingencies as we move into February.
right. Well, maybe we'll look at what happened in February then. But just to, as it were, set the scene for what was going on, Minister Swan, I think, attended 5 Cobras, isn't that right, from the 24th of January onwards? Yes?
Yes.
So he attended the Cobras throughout February, not you?
Yes, because I wasn't invited.
Minister Swan suggested that the invitation had gone to the Executive Office and that he had been designated, as it were, the representative from Northern Ireland to go to Cobra. Is that correct?
No, he was not designated by myself or the First Minister to attend. The invitation was at a health level. It was being chaired by Matt Hancock, the Health Minister in England, and they were pitched at that level, and it never came through either my desk or Arlene Foster's desk in terms of trying to, I suppose, to ask the Health Minister to attend. That was never brought to our attention. As far as and our understanding was that this was pitched very much at a health response at that stage. It was only whenever we were invited to a Prime Minister-led Cobra, which we then attended.
All right, I'll come back to that one on the 2nd of March. But I think that it must be right then, and I think from what you've said that this is correct, that the principal forum within which you were exercising your collective responsibility over the response to the pandemic was in the Executive Committee meetings during February. Is that right? I don't think we have a minute. We certainly haven't seen one for the meeting that I think took place on the 2nd or 3rd of February. That was the first time that the Executive Committee met, I think.
Yep.
Correct? Which would have been very shortly after you received that briefing. But I think we do have the one for the next meeting, which is INQ 000 065 706. And I think if we just scroll down, please. And scroll down. There we go. So this appears to be the update that was given at this would have been the second meeting in February. I think this was the 10th of February. So by this stage, cases in the United Kingdom, correct?
Yes.
So just thinking again about the Rooney note that you had been sent at the end of February about spreading beyond China, it was now pretty much on your doorstep, correct?
Yes.
And if we just scroll down, see reference there, likely at some time we'll have a case in Northern Ireland. Yes?
Yes.
Officials to consider public health legislation. If we could scroll down, please. We've already seen this, the reference to the Department of Health working hard in the background. The First Minister seems to have asked if there would be similar powers to England. You say, keep us up to date. And that's it. That hardly speaks of interrogation or collective scrutiny of the health response, does it?
So with this, I mean, these notes are handwritten notes, which you know that we weren't even aware were being taken. And I don't know how reflective they are actually of our entire conversation. I can say, and I'm very confident, that we all were interrogating the evidence that was being put forward from health. And at this stage, we were still also being told we're in containment phase. At this stage, we were being told that that health were in the lead and that we didn't, that they weren't advancing NICMA being stood up even at that stage. But yes, I'm fairly certain that we did. I mean, I think that note doesn't reflect, certainly, it could reflect a flippancy, but that certainly wasn't there.
Well, we've got some very, very long notes of meetings, so I think we can be fairly confident that there's some approximation between the length of the note and the length of the meeting.
And perhaps I wouldn't have interrogated so much in the meeting, given that we had been speaking with health to advance that to that conversation.
I was very clear about asking you, Ms O'Neill, whether or not the collective responsibility for the response to the pandemic was being exercised through the Executive Committee meetings, and you agreed with me.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm saying that I'm not sure that note reflects just the depth of conversations that we would have had in an ongoing way.
So you've brought up containment. What were the steps being taken in Northern Ireland then in the containment phase at this stage?
So I think I would have to refer to the containment plans that the Department of Health had published, and I don't have them in front of me because I didn't know you were going to ask me about the specifics.
You mean the
of
plans of the 3rd of March?
The plans in terms of how we were going to contain the virus, which was obviously the approach from those early days in terms of trying to keep things out, particularly around travel. That was the issue which the Cobra were examining, because all cases at this stage were referred to being directly related to travel. So the containment phase was based around trying to keep the virus out. And it was very clear from health that they were in the space that they thought that we could still potentially contain the virus.
Okay. And above and beyond then travel, what else? What other measures were the government in Northern Ireland, what had been implemented or what was being done that you were aware of?
So the Civil Contingencies branch were supporting health and had started the work around talking to departments around their own preparedness, what perhaps different government departments might do to support the wider societal response. That was something that was being added to on a continual basis. You will have seen the note that would reflect what was happening, for example, in the Department of the Economy or the Department of Communities. And I think that was the focus of the civil contingencies at that time up until the early March period.
I think we've seen evidence that there were 2 people who worked in the civil contingencies branch. Is that what you're referring to? Work that those
people were doing to support the health-led response. But I will say this, I mean, the austerity agenda for 10 years stripped out our health service, our civil contingencies branch, and all of our public services. That meant that our public services were in a very poor state in which to respond to the pandemic. We also had a situation where, in terms of civil contingencies, a lot of those staff that were there were redirected to deal with the Brexit situation, and that meant that we were further behind in terms of preparedness, which I think we talked about in the first module, that we were 18 months behind. So there's no doubt that our system was stretched to breaking point. There's no doubt that it wasn't in a state of preparedness. There's no doubt that the resources and the staff weren't there. And there's no doubt that that made the response to the pandemic very, very difficult.
I'm sure we'll move on to this, but 85 people were trained to work in the hub. So it wasn't a question of people not having been trained, for example. The problem was that when, very late in the day, the hub was stood up, only 2 people volunteered to work in it.
And I found that shocking also. And I think it also points to the fact that even the head of the civil service can't insist that people move to work in this area whenever you need them to. And I think that's a fault line for sure. But I think that you can't escape the fact that the executive's in place only a short number of weeks, and it's coming in to deal with a backlog of all the issues of the day of government, but equally alongside that, not to repeat myself, but all those issues that we were dealing with in terms of the state of readiness, preparedness, the decimation of the public services. I mean, 10 years of stripping out. We also had the backdrop of our health workers, our health and social care workers, our nurses were out on strike. And that was the first thing that the executive settled in those very early days in terms of trying to offer a fair pay award and safe staffing levels for the staff, because they were on their knees.
I think I just really want to focus on what you did and what the executive committee were doing at this point in time, because that didn't require lots of people to be able to scrutinise what the Department of Health was doing. And perhaps if we move on to the next meeting, that's INQ 000 065 692. Thank you. If we just scroll down again, please. And if we continue to scroll down. I'm just going to bookmark there. We see reference to the CCG meeting taking place. And if we just scroll down a little more, please. I think that's it. Oh, yes, sorry, if we scroll down. Yes, I think that is it. I don't want to be unfair. There's something at 8, but it seems to refer back to what had been discussed earlier in the meeting. So if we could please just scroll back up again. Thank you. I think we can see that almost everything that is said by the Department of Health. I don't think, but of course please say if I'm wrong, that we see much evidence of questioning, challenging, scrutinising, asking questions by you and your colleagues. Do you agree?
I think that this reflects quite a detailed run through all sorts of areas of work that were underway, including the regulations being developed, the fact that education, DAERA, finance, economy were all already working with health. I think it reflects where we are at that point in time, but I think that I'm fairly certain, despite this note, I'm fairly certain that our whole executive was engaged, very engaged, and working away trying to see what their department could bring to the table as they did throughout the course of the pandemic.
I am going to come, Ms O'Neill, to look at the plans, because we've seen an overarching plan dated the 13th of March, and we have, I'm sure you're aware, asked questions of civil servants and ministers about what those plans amounted to. But just coming back to the point about questions or challenge or scrutiny, that's not conveyed by this minute, is it? It's an update.
It's an update in terms of the urgent decision on the regulations. I believe
this is not substantive discussion, is it?
But I still don't think that this note reflects the scale of conversation that we would have had in our executive meetings, which would have been considerably in detail. As a matter of fact, at one stage, I think I did actually ask that notes are kept verbatim so that we would have that type of information, but I don't think this reflects the fact that the executive committee together was collectively scrutinising what was coming forward.
So, sorry, are you saying that the discussions that took place in February were substantive discussions about
I think it's fair to say that the substantive discussions came from early March, but there was certainly a lot of discussion in advance of that.
Yes, because I was going to say, Ms O'Neill, you say at paragraph 34 of your witness statement, on the 2nd of March 2020, the executive held its first substantive discussion about COVID-19.
Yes.
So the discussions that took place in February were not substantive discussions, were they?
It's at that juncture of March where it starts to become an all of executive moving towards the NICMA arrangements being stood up. So therefore, you'll see from every note from that, that's where it starts to become more detailed.
Again, I think that's a question that permits of a yes or no answer.
Well, the first, I've acknowledged in my statement, the first substantive discussion is the 2nd of March. Yeah.
Yes. So again, these discussions in February, these meetings, this collective responsibility that the Executive Committee is exercising over the response to the pandemic in Northern Ireland did not involve any substantive discussion. Correct?
I will say that because I'm not going to continue to argue back that there were substantive conversations happening with the Department of Health, with myself and the First Minister, with the head of the Civil Service around the preparedness and what the role of the Department of Health was as we then moved towards the role of the wider executive.
Ms O'Neill, I'm not here to argue with you. I'm just repeating what you have said in your witness statement. On the 2nd of March 2020, the Executive held its first substantive discussion about COVID-19.
Yes, I did say that.
And if we can just complete the meetings in February, if we could go please to INQ 000 273 788. And if you could scroll to page 9, please. So again, to be clear, this is the 24th of February. And if we could go over the page, please. That's it.
Sorry, did you ask me a question?
Well, you knew by this stage it's the 24th of February. There is obviously a very considerable amount of information known and available to you about the position that had been reached and the risk that Northern Ireland was at. And this is the collective responsibility being exercised. Do you agree?
Yes, this was our conversation, yes.
And it barely amounts to anything, does it?
Again, it's a handwritten note that I can't stand over.
Even assuming, and of course it must be right, that this isn't a full note.
I just don't think it reflects the nature of what we were dealing with in those early days.
Well, I think it reflects, doesn't it, what you said in your witness statement at paragraph 34, that there hadn't been any substantive discussion until the 2nd of March. It's consistent with that, isn't it?
Yes.
My lady, I think we're probably just coming up to the break. My
I'm
lady,
terribly
is that...
sorry, I was-
No. I could see you were deep in concentration. I think we'd come to the break.
I'm
And
sorry,
that
there's no
seemed like a-
disrespect to you. So, no, so sorry. I'm sure you're used to multitasking. I shall be back at 11:30.